Yep, we are live, and I've ended the show and I've started it on YouTube. I'm seeing myself delayed on YouTube. Warren is in, Mr. Bob Farnham is in, Mr. Tom Morris is in, and we're ready for the after show. The after show is officially on. Joey, that was, I would say, beautiful.
Was great show, buddy.
Except for my mute, except for when I muted myself.
Twice.
When the dog, did I do it twice?
Twice this week. No, you've never done it twice in 1 week.
You know why? Because I've got this mute button on the microphone, and I should just stop using it.
Well, your dog was barking the first time. In your defense,
I know he was barking a lot yesterday or the day before. But you know, I knew that Tom was going to love this because, you know, when I did my search for quotes on, you know, curiosity and questions, all the quotes were by philosophers. And so I thought this is going to attract Tom Morris like a moth to a flame.
Hey, Warren, this was unbelievably good. Thank you. I want to officially adopt you as my cousin or something. We'll get the paperwork going on that. But meanwhile, I've got 4 points. And my first point is this. One thing you helped me understand today is that most people think of questions as being merely transactional. I hand you a question, you hand me an answer. But you helped me realize in a new way today that maybe the best questions aren't transactional, they're transformational.
Right, absolutely.
And the direction you've been going from thinking of questions in terms of getting information to then thinking of questions in terms of innovation, and then coming back to understanding questions as a communication tool, and then making the leap to understanding questions as a leadership tool, it struck me that questions are also a great, and this is kind of a generic for leadership, they're a relationship tool.
Yeah.
I've been thinking more and more as a philosopher recently about the importance of partnerships in everything we do. And you never really develop a great partnership unless you have a great relationship. Yeah. And you never do that without great questions, right, that bring people together. A friend of mine says there are 2 views of marriage. One is it's all about, it's a partnership view of getting things done. And the other view of marriage is an intimacy model. And so one partner in a marriage can think we've got a great marriage, meaning we get a lot of things done. And the other partner can think, no, we don't, because we're not intimate with each other. We don't really know each other. Questions at their best in a relationship, like a marriage or even a business partnership, facilitate making both those things happen better. Yeah. Getting things done together and getting to know each other better. That struck me as really powerful. And now let me just say one more thing, because there's just so much I could say. You just got my brain going like this. But the other thing is I love your concept of a counterfeit question. And it reminds me of a concept I use a lot of counterfeit wisdom. And they're both very parallel. You said a counterfeit question is not driven by genuine curiosity. Likewise, counterfeit wisdom, in my view, is not driven by a genuine honesty or concern with truth. It's a manipulative thing. You're trying to appease people. You're trying to get people to give you their money. You're trying to get people excited about hyperbolic promises. It's not rooted in honesty and in truth. So that's a real parallel. I would want to ask you about your thing. Your definition of a counterfeit question really struck me as interesting. Not driven by genuine curiosity. I would want to add a little addendum. Counterfeit question, I would want to say, is not driven by either genuine curiosity or an honest therapeutic intent. And what I mean by that is sometimes a therapist can ask a patient a question, but the therapist already knows the answer. So it's not driven by genuine curiosity on the therapist's part. Yeah. But the therapist is hoping that the question will get the patient to realize, like, why do you think you did that? Right. And the therapist already knows the answer. So she's not curious about the answer.
Yeah.
But she wants to ask the question for a therapeutic purpose to help the patient.
Oh,
well,
we could add yet another addendum onto that. I've thought about this. In addition to therapeutic, it could be educational.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So
there you go.
A teacher can be asking a question, or think about Socratic questioning, where the person in the Socrates role knows the answer already, but is asking the question in order to guide someone toward their own realization, right?
And you know what's super weird about
there are positive uses of questioning where, or we could go to the case of the attorney who's cross-examining someone and trying to trip them up and knows the answer. So there are definitely specific positive uses of questioning where you do know the answer and you have a purpose that you're trying to achieve. And it's probably not fair to call those counterfeit questioning because they're very purposeful questioning.
What I love,
maybe it's kind of like we have to put something about purposeful in there, like there either has to be curiosity or a legitimate, positive, specific purpose behind the question.
It's productive rather than destructive, right?
Productive,
it's creative in some way and not destructive. That would be a great way of drawing the distinction. And I love your use of Socrates because he had this weird epistemology by which he believed that when he questioned the young slave boy about geometry, he believed that the boy in his soul already knew all the answers. So Socrates knew the answers, and he believed the boy he was questioning knew the answers. But the purpose of the questioning was to elicit into the conscious mind what may have already been unconscious. And so that is, again, almost like therapy. That's education, almost like therapy, right?
That's coaching. That's coaching as well.
That's absolutely coaching.
So one of the things, one of the reasons questioning is so powerful in coaching or therapy, and what I say in the book, in the Book of Beautiful Questions, is this should not be limited just to coaches and therapists. Right. We all should be doing this. Is that you can use questioning to guide someone else's thinking about a problem. And so what you can do is you can use questioning as a substitute for advice. And so a lot of us are very free with advice, right? We're very free about giving advice. And a lot of times it's not that good, or people don't want it, or they don't respond well to it. So the idea is you can use questioning as a substitute for that, where instead of telling somebody what you think they should do, you use questioning to try to help them get to it themselves. And you use questioning in a way where you would say things like, well, what have you tried already to address this problem? Okay, now when you tried those things, what happened? What did you notice about what worked and what didn't work? Okay, now based on that, what do you think you might do differently tomorrow? So you can use this sort of sequence of questioning to get people to sort of come up with ideas and solutions themselves instead of you saying, hey, here's what I think you should do about that problem.
And the cool thing is, if somebody said to you, Warren, well, why go to all that trouble if you could just tell them what they need to do? The reason is the questions have a weird and powerful alchemy. So the answer becomes owned by the person who articulates it, right? A level of ownership, which is always going to be responsible for more action than if you don't feel ownership of the idea.
And that gets to the larger thing with questions, the larger power of questions. When I talk about a company doing a mission question instead of a mission statement, you want all the activity to be happening on the other person's end. You want them to be coming up to a realization about something. You want them to be deciding, am I better off 4 years ago? You want them to be deciding that. You don't want to be telling them that. So that's the real power of question, is that you can sort of flip it so that the person on the other end of the question does the thinking and does the deciding and does the realizing.
And if I can ask one more question and then I'll shut up. My question is this: when you suggest that on the part of coaches, on the part of leaders, I was wondering if a certain idea had entered into it. Namely, when a question is asked and before it's answered, it creates what psychologists often call cognitive dissonance, a sort of a pressure. There's a pressure. There's a question looming in the room and nobody's answered it yet. There's a tension, there's a pressure. Some of the very wisest people have said that to live best in this world, we have to learn to live with questions and not always have to have an answer. So there's two things you can do with pressure. One is you can try to release it, get rid of it, get an answer really fast. The other is you can try to live with it. And sometimes the living with a question is what makes the question transformative,
right?
Rather than just trying to do a quick transaction with it, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering if in your work about leadership, around leadership and coaching and that sort of thing, if that idea about pressure and dissonance had entered into your thinking at all, or is that something you're kind of yet to explore?
It's sort of like, you know, at the root of a lot of this is the idea of living. Are you able to live with questions? Are you able to live with uncertainty?
Yeah, there you go.
That's where it's a big challenge for leaders. You know,
Yeah,
it's almost like turning the old leadership model upside down.
Yeah.
Because the old model was based on certainty. You know, you had to project certainty. You had to feel super confident.
Yep.
You had to act as if you had all the answers. If you did all those things, then people would follow you. And
that's where you got your authority, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But so the idea now that is sort of bubbling up, and I'm talking about it, so are lots of other people, is the idea that maybe that model isn't valid anymore. And maybe there's a new model of leadership that, because we're in a different world now, and people don't want to be told what to do quite the way they did before. There's a little more of an independent streak in people. And there's also a world that's much more complex. And no one really believes that anyone has all the answers. So if a leader now comes along and says, oh yeah, I know it all. All you got to do is follow my gut instincts and you'll be fine. There are leaders who say that, but you know, most people now don't buy it and they don't go for that. So there's a feeling now that there has to be a new kind of leader that is willing to admit they don't have all the answers and is willing to live with uncertainty and have the organization live with uncertainty. And so that's kind of a radical new approach. It creates a lot of discomfort because again, it's going against what the leaders, someone put it in an interesting way. They said, for a leader to operate successfully in this model, in this new model of leadership, they have to have both tremendous confidence and tremendous humility. So they have to have this balance of confidence and humility. So they have to be humble enough to admit they don't have all the answers, but they also have to be confident enough that they can do that and people will still follow them. See, if you have a leader who's not all that confident, that leader will never believe that if they admit weakness, they will never believe that people will follow them. They'll assume people won't follow me. Once they know I don't have all the answers, they'll see through me, they won't follow me anymore. So it takes that confident person to say, yeah, I can do that. I can admit I don't know. And I think people will still follow me.
I think that's a great combination. And, you know, Warren, a thing in the backdrop here is leaders, when they have a metaphor of their work, that's a military metaphor or a factory production metaphor,
right.
In those contexts, the leader's supposed to know what he's doing, right? You don't go into battle and ask everybody, what do you guys think we should do now? But if you model the business more on a research laboratory, right, which is more appropriate for knowledge workers that most of us are now, in a great research laboratory, the head researcher helps everybody else ask all the right questions, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And his leader because of that.
Interesting, the military model, I don't know whether something's changing there, because a couple of the people that have contacted me about coming and talking recently have been the U.S. Army.
Good.
You know, well, NASA you would expect, but a couple of different military branches have picked up the book and gotten into it, and apparently something there is resonating. And it's kind of surprising to me because I don't necessarily think of the military as being a place that would embrace questioning in their, you know, but it seems to be resonating there. So,
I want to.
Robin, how you doing?
Robin, welcome Robin as well. And you know, I had to the minute Robin, I don't know whether Robin is sitting down or standing, took themselves on camera. I knew that they were Zoom bombing us, so that's why you can unmute and ask a question at any point. I want to ask an obvious question relating to definitely your topic on critical thinking, or critical thinking being in critical condition, but also look at what's happening with these press briefings. And it's funny, of all the questions that have been asked, and I'm specifically wondering how in the environment, in a hostile press environment, right, whether it is the president talking or whether it is the press secretary talking, there was one, I forget his name, he stood up and he almost asked the I give up question. He said, why do you tell so many lies, or why have you been lying, or how can you live with yourself from lying so many times?
Yeah.
But ironically, that's the question that stuck with me. But I guess my question to you is, what is a beautiful question for a journalist to ask? And I don't want to just put you on the spot, it's to anyone. Like, is there a beautiful question for any journalist to ask in this environment where the answer is going to be circuitous and obtuse and I'll just in fairness say it's not just to the press secretary or the president, it's to any politician. How do we ask beautiful questions that can get us closer to beautiful answers when, quite frankly, we're watching nothing more than just a game of smoke and mirrors?
I thought there was an interview done recently by was it the Australian journalist?
Jonathan Swan.
What was it?
Jonathan Swan.
Axios.
I thought he did
Fantastic.
a really good job. And it was striking how different his approach was from so much of the interviewing of the president that's been done. And all he did really was ask follow-up questions. I mean, that was the only thing he did. That was what he did differently from everybody else. And it showed how powerful it can be when a journalist doesn't just give up and go on to the next question, but actually tries to pin down the subject and actually force, in this case, Trump, to deal with a question, not just to dance around it or walk away from it. And it was surprisingly effective. And what it revealed, what it showed me is that the journalists in general are not doing a great job, because that's something that should be going on all the time. Now, part of the problem is that they don't always have one-on-one access to them. But you know what? Then they should use the press conferences more productively to build on each other's questions. And people have talked about this. Why isn't this happening? When someone asks a question at a press briefing and it doesn't get answered, and the next journalist asks a completely different question, because that's their question and they have a list and they want to get their question out there. Well, what they're doing is they're kind of undermining the process when they do that. I really wish that they would pick up on the last question that their fellow journalist asked and say, hey, I want to follow up on that. You didn't really answer that question and I want to go deeper on it. And, I would like to see more of that. That to me would be beautiful questioning by journalists. It's the simple follow-up.
Why do we have that problem, Warren? Having been a journalist yourself, has there been a problem subsequently with the training of journalists, or is there a problem in the culture of journalism now? What
Access.
Do you think?
Access.
I think part of it too is, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, other than maybe there might be a little bit of ego involved on the journalist's part, in terms of saying, I have my question and I don't really care about somebody else's question. I want to ask my question.
Joey mentioned the idea of access. Are they worried that if they follow up too brutally, they'll lose their access to any questions?
They have lost access. That's a big piece of it.
We've seen that. We've seen some threats of that, and we've seen people be barred from the press.
But it's funnily enough, Warren, it's something I've thought of. I've thought the same thought that you just mentioned, which is, if everyone just asked the same question, and it doesn't even have to be, collusion. It can just be a natural, which is we're just going to follow suit. You would see, and it comes back to your definition of a beautiful question. You would see action. You would see change. It would be immediate, because the reality is the most powerful person allegedly on the face of this earth would suddenly be rendered toothless and impotent. And again, any president, because they'd either have to answer the question or they'd walk out the room. That whole outlet, the access would be reversed. And it's just, I mean, it seems so simple. Here we are, just a bunch of us sitting on an after show.
Also, I just want to return to Joseph. You mentioned that question that somebody asked at a press briefing, I think, where he said, what did he ask? Like, why do you lie so much?
Why do you lie? Like, how do you live with yourself with all these lies?
And you know what's interesting is like a lot of whether something is a great question depends on the context, right? And it depends on the actual situation where the question's being asked. Like if someone had asked that question of Obama, I would have considered that to be a really obnoxious, ridiculous question. However, someone asking that of Trump is, in some ways, it fits the definition that I use of a beautiful question, which is a beautiful question is the question that steps back and asks what everyone should be asking and what everyone's wondering about, but nobody wants to ask it, right? That's oftentimes a great question is the one that it's like the elephant in the room, right? It's like the question everybody's wondering, but nobody wants to ask it because they're afraid it's too impolite or it's too rude. And in that instance, I actually feel like that was probably in some ways an amazing question, a beautiful question, because it gets to the core of what we're dealing with here, which is the constant lying that never stops. And you feel like someone needs to question that at some point and just say, why are we even here at a press conference if everything is a lie? If everything is going to be a lie, it almost undermines the whole purpose of us being here. So I think that was in some ways a really courageous question by that journalist, and I didn't feel like it was coming from a bad place. To me, it felt like it was just an acknowledgement of the root of the problem. The root. There's something we're dealing with here, and we might as well get down to the base of it, because it's everything else kind of revolves around that. So I kind of liked that question. I thought it was a really good, fundamental, courageous question, but I'm sure that, there are people that would have exactly the opposite view of that question. There's some people that would look at that and say, oh, he's just trying to bait the president, or he's just being obnoxious. Probably even I bet even some of the other journalists in that room probably thought it was an improper question, but
I think the opposite stands true with Jonathan Swan. So I think that other journalists looked at Jonathan Swan and went, oh my God, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's like the Tim Russert rolling in his grave kind of problem. You talk about the power of questions. Tim Russert did so much research on every single guest. Right. And everyone who came on Meet the Press knew that Tim was going to ask very poignant, profound questions. And if you came out with some ridiculous limp answer like Trump does with every single question, he would hammer you and he would follow up until you actually came up with the truth, which the whole reminiscence of, what's a beautiful question for Tim Russert, for me personally, it's always, is that true?
Right. Yeah.
Because is it true? And then do you know absolutely that it's true? And that goes all the way back to Socrates, right? The whole idea, is it true? And introspection wise, is it true? For me, every time I have a weird thought that comes into my brain that tells me I'm a loser or I'm not doing something correctly, that first question for me is it true? Because that's the best follow-up question you could possibly have. I just add something else.
There was also something else that Jonathan Swan did, which is the questions didn't seem like gotcha questions.
They weren't.
And he almost I don't want to say duped Trump, but he looked kind of like, but like he looked almost like I don't like he was asking a question. He was puzzled, but he absolutely in this case knew the answer. This was the bit of the Jedi. This was Jedi mind tricks. But it was disarming as opposed to.
He used a very good tone too, and tone is really important with questioning. A lot of journalists go right to this sort of attack tone, which is the gotcha questions, and they sort of take the tone of the prosecutor. You know, he had a slightly different tone. It was tough, but it was also conversational, and it wasn't quite as it struck me anyway. It wasn't quite as aggressive as you know, let's say a Mike Wallace type interview or something like that. And I think that worked. I think that helped because it lowered the guard a little bit of Trump, which is what you want to do, right? And then it would allow him to sort of get in there and ask a really powerful, a really tough question. And then, of course, the guard would go back up, but it gave him some opportunities to go in there that you might not have if you were strictly doing a confrontational approach right from the start.
Yeah, I mean, he asked him, and like he said, "We're the best in the world," and he's like, "In the world?" You know, it was just like a very friendly question, trying to say,
Right.
"I don't understand what that means in the world."
Yeah.
And he said, "Yeah, we're the." And so it was anytime he asked him a question, it was a very simple follow-up question. And to your point, Warren, it's exactly, if the question isn't great unless it's in the context. His questions were great in the context of his interview.
Yeah.
And that's why I think he's such a powerful journalist. And that's where, for me, it's why I'm screaming at Chuck Todd when I watch Meet the Press, because I'm just, ask a follow-up question,
Yeah.
just one follow-up question, just one, and he never does.
And the
it's
funny
a delicate
thing,
balance too between like doing what you use the term gotcha questions and doing, you know, legitimate hard-hitting questions, and it's sometimes hard to find the difference between the two, you know. But there definitely is a problem with journalists sometimes asking gotcha questions, and to me, that's almost like it's almost like I would define a gotcha question as there's something fake about it. It's a setup. It's some kind of a setup, and it's something that has been decided in advance that we can sort of trick someone into saying this or whatever. And I do have a problem with that. That gets used sometimes a little too much in journalism. So, but it can be hard to figure out where's the difference. Where's the point where the good, hard, investigative journalist question slips over into something that's more like a question that's sort of has bad intentions, or is designed to make the journalist look good, is designed to make the subject look bad, you know, so that the journalist looks better.
You know, Warren, I was just thinking that the beauty of like this whole conversation is that when you think of a question and an answer as partners, right, or partners in crime, but the reality is that the concept of a question in reality should not be one way. It should be two-way. And any question that is unidirectional is not really a question, right? It's a statement, it's a commandment, it's an order, it's a monologue. And what I was just thinking of even in this conversation is that a question, a real beautiful question, is not just open-ended. I don't mean that, you know, versus like, you know, is it multiple choice, but it's open for interpretation. The context is so important. And I'll give you just the context of that context, which is Joey and I, I don't know if you can hear me at the moment, but there is. But, you know, Joey and I come from the marketing and advertising world, and we do all these pitches, and you would try and role play, and you would try and anticipate the client questions about cost and price and this and bodies and whatever. And then I think, you know, exhibit 2 will be the debates coming up. And you can probably plan until the cows come home for every question, for every, you know, every known or obvious or even less obvious question, but you can never prepare yourself for the moment of truth. And as you say, how the question is asked and what the follow-up question is going to be. And just as prepared as you think you might be, you can actually end up being a shadow of your former self if you aren't able to place that question in context.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I've been in.
You know, I was had another thought about gotcha questions, and as distinguished from the question by the journalist who asked, why do you lie? Why do you lie so much? Most gotcha questions are closed-ended questions. So a typical gotcha question begins with the phrase, isn't it true that, you notice how many gotcha questions start with the phrase, isn't it true that, and then it's simply the yes or no answer, right? And always the person says, no, that's not true, I deny it. But what I love about that question at the press briefing, it was an open-ended question. Is it why? It was a why question. You know, why do you lie so much? A lot of times journalists don't ask those kind of open-ended questions. They're more going for the closed question where they can get a factual answer out of somebody. But I love the power of an open question in that situation. It can really throw people off, right? Because they're just not expecting someone to ask, you know, for the rationale of why you're lying so much. So it was a very interesting approach to take by that journalist.
By the way, Jan, who's a regular on this after show, his technique, he's like what we call the silent but violent client, because he sits, he listens, he ponders, but he's formulating, the perfect question. And I think it's time for him to ask that question now. No pressure, Jan.
No, that was great, Warren. And the thing that it reminds me of is when context is important. So context of the environment in which the journalist is with the subject. You know, if you're with a David Frost, or somebody who might be like a David Frost today, if that ever would exist again, where you have 90 minutes, or Dick Cavett, 60 to 90 minutes, that's where you can get to some real open stuff and get beyond the bullshit. But when you have to stand up and ask a question of somebody who already knows what they're going to say because they've already prepped for that question, I think everybody's talking here, it's infuriating. And so the idea of, for me, what I like Joey, yeah, I'm aggravated that they don't, or somebody else doesn't ask the follow-up. So my thinking is, and training was to ask the follow-up in my question. In other words, say, in a previous question or in a previous statement, you were asked such and such about Russia, and you said such and such. My question is, did you mean this? Did you mean that? You know, my question comes then because it takes me to the next level, not getting the same old stuff, just regurgitated that they're already rehearsing. You know, like today there was a statement by somebody who was supporting Trump, I think in the administration, that in fact he did say to Putin directly that he should not meddle in the election. And he said to the journalist, it's just not true. It's documented. The tape is there. And he even alluded to something about having his shoes peed on when somebody else is saying it's rain. You know, it was like crazy. So I think his name is Jake Tapper or something on CNN. He then went to not during the interview, but later, went to the file and showed exactly what Trump said when he said those words. And indeed, he did say to Putin, in front of Putin, in a jokey kind of wink, wink way, promise you're not going to meddle in the election. Right. And they both laughed on the platform. That's what he was referring to as documentation for Trump standing up to Russia about not meddling in the election. Right.
You know, there's a very good book. I don't know if you know about this book, Warren. It's by a British philosopher in the 1950s named J.L. Austin. It's called How to Do Things with Words. And Austin makes this important point that he's mostly concerned with statements, but it would apply just as well to questions. When a statement is made, he distinguishes three different things that are going on. Like the minister says at a marriage ceremony, I pronounce you man and wife. Most of us would say, okay, there's a cognitive propositional content. He is saying that they are man and wife. That's what Austin calls locutionary force. But there's an illocutionary force. It's the force of the statement that makes something come about. In saying that, the minister actually marries them. That's another force the statement has. But there's a third force. The caterer is outside in the hallway and he hears the words, I pronounce you man and wife. Okay, that means I get the food hot. Mm-hmm. So, but that's very different than effecting a marriage. That was the secondary thing that it does. That's, alerting the caterer. Likewise, in press conferences, on both sides, there's theater going on. There's performance going on. There are things being done, how to do things with words. There are things being done with the words that are different from what you and I, as the audience watching this on TV, want to see happen. It's almost like Diogenes carrying around a lighted lamp in the day. What are you doing? I'm looking for an honest man, right? We want honesty on both sides of that press conference. We want honest questions, authentic, not counterfeit questions. And we want honest answers, authentic, not counterfeit answers. But we're getting counterfeit, we're getting faux on both sides these days, too much, right? So when the one honest man asks the really honest question, it's not performative. He's not playing a game. It's not theater of any kind. He's asking what we all want to know. And by the way, with your idea of a counterfeit question, the guy who says, well, why do you lie all the time? He could be asking out of genuine curiosity.
I think he is.
Or he could be asking therapeutically.
Right.
Or he could be asking educationally. But in either of those three cases, it's an authentic, not a counterfeit question. And that moves our hearts when we see that. We say, oh my God, why isn't everybody doing that all the time?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. One thing I came across recently with Trump is the idea of, I'm in writing about questioning, one of the things is, one of the kind of rules is that we're supposed to be accepting of almost every question or any question. And I was thinking about how that applies to Trump asking about using chemicals in our bodies and using sunlight to treat coronavirus. And he phrased it. He did phrase it as a question, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so it raises the question, if you do believe that anything is open to questioning, how are you supposed to feel about a question like that? A question that is, and I mean, I was really bothered by it, like most people. But then I thought, well, if you really do accept this position that a person should be able to ask almost anything without being penalized, if we want to encourage curiosity, and we can't assume that he wasn't curious about that as a possibility, because he might have been curious about whether that would really work as a solution. So then it raises the question of, to me as a questionologist, how am I supposed to feel about that question, even though it was based on ignorance? Is it wrong for him to ask it?
It's a dangerous context. It was asked, if it were asked privately in front of 3 or 4 specialists, it's utterly okay. If it's asked on national TV in front of millions of gullible followers, it's dangerous. Yeah. So it's the context.
And there were people who did ingest bleach and
yeah, I think that's a good point. That's probably the difference, is that he was doing it in a public forum, and therefore he needed to consider who else would be hearing it, and what that reaction might be. And so it's probably okay for him to ask it of the experts behind closed doors.
Right.
That would be an acceptable, even though it's still a stupid question, still ignorant, right? But it would be acceptable because he's trying to explore something that he's wondering about, and that would be acceptable. But to do it publicly, and I find a lot of the questioning that's done by the Trump administration, when they do ask questions, you know, they're not notoriously curious batch of people, but when they do ask questions, there are often questions that are asked with a real agenda behind them in terms of using questioning as a way to ask something very provocative and almost offensive, but phrasing it as a question and then saying, hey, we're only asking it, hey, it's only a question, you know, so we're allowed to do that. And I do think they really push the limits with that. They push the limits of questioning in terms of using it as a way to get unacceptable things or sort of disgusting things out there into the public forum by phrasing it as a question and then saying, hey, we're allowed to ask a question.
So I wanted to make 3 brief points, and then if anyone who hasn't spoken wants to just quickly ask a question, because we are a lot over what our after show is meant to be. But guess what? This is what happens now. So I'm just going to give up on that. So the first thing is, I think, you know, if you study people from an ethnographic standpoint, if, you know, from a philosophical, from all these standpoints, history is going to look back at this time and study this wile e. coyote of a person who might have come across as a bit of a buffoon or an imbecile, but at the end of the day, has answered probably a record number of questions, and he has never been gotcha'd or found out, for the most part, even like a Sarah Palin might have. And how he's been able to deflect and do all of these things, I think, you know, it's fascinating, because I don't know that anyone has quite done it this way. Now that said, so that's the first point. The second point is, what I've learned from you in particular, Warren, is we have to be able to, instead of looking at him, we have to be able to look at all the journalists in the room as well. And when we do study, and when we do reflect, and when we do post-mortem, we will need to also point fingers at them, to ask them and critically ask them why they weren't able to ask better questions, more beautiful questions, however you want to define it. And then the third point, which is not really kind of connected to that, but going back to even the question, as you said, you questioned yourself being a questionologist. I think there might have been clearly better ways of being more curious, by being more open-ended, and by being able to say, hey, listen, what is happening right now, what we're going through is unprecedented on so many levels. And pretty much the only people that could have predicted this are the Clancys and the Rollinses and the Pattersons and the Browns that have written about these, you know, almost sci-fi type of viruses. Is it possible that there might be a solution out there that could transcend, whether it's logic, whether it's, you know, I don't want to say science, but at least conventional thinking? And how might we get to that solution, if there is in fact one? But to Tom's point, that curious childlike approach, it's not appropriate, you know, coming from the president in that kind of setting. But yeah, so those are just some reflections, trying to like kind of almost connect some of the dots. Yeah, those are just my reflections. Anyone want to add anything? Mr. Morris?
The only novel ever written, to my knowledge, of all questions, every sentence ends with a question mark in the entire novel.
Really?
I bought it for my son years ago in 2009 when it came out, and he somehow managed to slip out of the house without reading it. So I found it in my books in preparation for today. It's called The Interrogative Mood, a novel, question mark, by Paget Powell. Paget Powell, the only novel ever written only of questions. You look every page, there is no period, only questions. And by the way, you
interrogative.
What's that?
The interrogative mood.
Interrogative mood. And I just wanted to end by saying, Warren, you are a brilliant man to build an industry on the question mark. like the lady who wrote the book about commas, eats, shoots, and leaves.
Right.
And I'm going to pick the exclamation mark and build the rest of my career around that.
By the way, is that book any good?
This one,
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to find out, and I'll
You
let
haven't read it.
I'll let
Okay.
you know. I just found it in preparation for you being here today.
Well,
Yeah.
So I'll shoot you an email or something and let you know.
Okay. Yeah, let me know.
well, did you notice that Warren? That was a question. Is that book any good? So
Good
just
publisher, good blurbs on the back. So
to anybody out there, do not attempt to build a business around a question mark because it's taken. But exclamation point is still available. Semicolon. You know.
No, I actually welcome people that get into the whole questioning thing because, you know, when I find I look for people who are studying it and doing, and, you know, because I feel like if you want to try to build something like that's almost like a movement, if you want to call it that, then you're better off finding other people that are on the same turf and, you know, trying to collaborate with them if you can, as opposed to saying, oh, there's somebody who's on my turf and I don't like that. So I'm finding that whenever I find someone who's interested in studying questioning or writing about it, I always try to connect with them and say, hey, is there anything we might be able to work on together? So,
Hey, Warren, one question for you. If I wanted to buy a book to interview people, like that's my goal, individual one-on-one interviews, you have so many books. So Beautiful Questions, The Classroom is 2020, and then Book of Beautiful Questions, and then A More Beautiful Question. Do you have any books that are more focused on like a one-on-one interview, kind of the journalism background you have, or are they?
Not really. I haven't written about that. I'm sure there are some good ones out there. I know there's a guy named Shane Snow, and I think Shane writes quite a bit about asking questions in the interview format. So that would be kind of someone to look at, maybe see what he has to say about it. And you know, I've just touched on that very briefly on some of the basic do's and don'ts of interviewing, but I haven't gone too deeply into it.
And then with that said, thank you. What about as far as the corporate book? You mentioned classroom. So just the differentiate between the classroom and the corporate is, if I was more interested in like consulting on companies, would it be the companies versus the classroom, or is there any differentiation?
No, the classroom one is really just for, that's just for education, teachers. And
okay.
I would say the Book of Beautiful Questions has a lot on leadership, consulting, coaching. So that's probably the one you're interested. That talks about how to use questioning as kind of a guiding tool, a coaching tool, and a leadership tool. So
and which book is that?
A good one. And then the first book that I wrote on it is A More Beautiful Question. It's more just conceptual, you know, sort of like getting the idea out there that questioning is really important and it's underappreciated. And so that's kind of the big picture book. And then the Book of Beautiful Questions is more practical, I would say, and it's zeroing in on specific areas like, here's how it relates to leadership. Here's how it relates to decision making. I have a whole section on decision making and how questioning.
I think that's the book, Joey.
Help you make better decisions.
Which is the name of that one? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to.
It's just called The Book of Beautiful Questions.
The Book of Beautiful Questions. Thank you.
That's the one to buy. Joey supports all of our guests. You know, you are the NPR of. Well, guys, Warren, this was. You know, this was just incredible, and just thank you for your time and for hanging out with us. Be warned, you could turn into a Tom Morris, which means you come for the interview and you stay for every day for the after show, which we love. But tomorrow, for those of you out there, I'm going to stop the recording in a second. But Bob and Tom and Joey and Jen, you guys are the stars of the show tomorrow. So I hope you guys are bringing your A game. I just get to sit down and do nothing. So I'm looking forward to that. Warren, I'll be in touch. I'm going to send you all the links and the files and stuff like that. And you made my job really hard today because I always try and find a 60-second soundbite. That's a highlight. It's one of these things where I'm like, oh God, there are just too many. There are too many. So wish me luck. It's going to be
thank you.
a long
you're doing
day.
a great job with this. And I love the whole after show thing that you're doing. And it's a really, this is definitely, I do a lot of podcasts these days. And this one is, you're going above and beyond in terms of what you're putting into it. So it's pretty cool.
Well, thank you, Warren, and also thank you,
What's
Robin.
the soundbite you're looking for?
No, I've stopped exploiting my guests for sound bites. But Robin, you're welcome to come and join us every day. We're here. I always say my standard line, and same applies to you, Warren, is don't do it for me, do it for the guests. So have a look at
I don't know if you want Robin there all the time. I just a brief warning, but you could try it if you like, but he's a bit of a troublemaker.
May I offer a question?
We love troublemakers.